The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds of Buckingham Palace as staff members hurried about their final preparations. Today marked the annual Summer Garden Party, one of the most anticipated events in the royal calendar. Hundreds of guests from various walks of life would soon gather on the pristine lawns to meet members of the royal family. Prince Charles stood by the tall windows of his private study, watching the bustling activity below. At 73, he had attended countless such gatherings, yet each one still held a certain charm for him. The sight of ordinary people mixing with dignitaries, all united in their excitement to be part of this tradition, never failed to warm his heart. The weather forecast had been promising all week. Clear skies, gentle breezes, and pleasant temperatures seemed guaranteed for the afternoon festivities. However, as Charles gazed upward, he noticed a few scattered clouds beginning to gather on the horizon. Having lived in Britain his entire life, he knew better than to trust completely in weather predictions. Meanwhile, across London and Downing Street, Boris Johnson was preparing for his own journey to the palace. The Prime Minister's schedule had been particularly demanding that week, with Brexit negotiations reaching a critical juncture and various domestic policies requiring his attention. The garden party offered a welcome respite from the intense political pressures that constantly surrounded him. Boris stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time. His unruly blonde hair, despite the efforts of his personal grooming team, maintained its characteristic disheveled appearance. His wife Carrie had already left for another engagement, leaving him to navigate the final preparations alone. The drive to Buckingham Palace would take approximately 20 minutes, depending on traffic conditions. Boris had attended several royal events since becoming Prime Minister, but the informal nature of the garden parties always made him slightly nervous. Unlike formal state dinners with their rigid protocols, these gatherings required a more relaxed approach to conversation and mingling. As his official car pulled away from Downing Street, Boris reviewed his mental notes about the various guests he might encounter. Representatives from charities, community leaders, military personnel, and countless others would be present. Each deserved his attention and respect, regardless of their political affiliations or personal opinions about his leadership. Back at the palace, Prince Charles had moved to the yellow drawing room, where he met with his private secretary to review the afternoon schedule. The guest list included several individuals whose work in environmental conservation particularly interested him. These conversations would provide genuine pleasure as sustainability and climate change remained close to his heart. The palace gardens had been transformed into an elegant outdoor venue. White marquees dotted the landscape, providing shelter and serving areas for the elaborate afternoon tea service. Round tables covered in crisp white linens were strategically placed throughout the grounds, creating intimate spaces for conversation while maintaining clear pathways for the royal family to move among their guests. Catering staff made final adjustments to the impressive array of sandwiches, cakes, and pastries that would soon be offered to the hundreds of attendees. The royal kitchens had been working since dawn to ensure everything met the impeccable standards expected at such events. Security personnel conducted their last sweep of the perimeter, checking every detail that might affect the safety and smooth operation of the gathering. While garden parties maintained a relaxed atmosphere, the presence of senior royals and government officials required constant vigilance. As the first guests began arriving at the palace gates, the excitement was palpable. Many had traveled from distant corners of the United Kingdom, viewing this invitation as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They passed through security checkpoints with patience and good humor, understanding the necessary procedures. The dress code called for formal day wear, and the variety of elegant outfits created a colorful tapestry across the gathering crowd. Ladies wore their finest dresses and hats, while gentlemen sported morning suits or military uniforms. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation and nervous energy. Prince Charles made his final preparations, selecting a lightweight gray suit appropriate for the outdoor setting. His decades of experience at such events had taught him the importance of comfortable clothing that would allow him to move freely among his guests for several hours. The royal household staff took their positions throughout the gardens, ready to assist guests and ensure the smooth flow of the afternoon's activities. Their expertise in managing these large-scale events was evident in every carefully planned detail. As the clock approached the official start time, both Prince Charles and Boris Johnson prepared to step into what would become an unexpectedly memorable afternoon. Neither could have predicted that a simple weather phenomenon would soon provide entertainment for hundreds of guests and create a moment of genuine human connection that would be remembered long after the formal proceedings had ended. The afternoon began exactly as planned, with Prince Charles emerging from the palace at precisely 3 o'clock to greet his first guests. The sun still shone brightly, though those observant clouds had grown more prominent against the blue sky. The prince moved gracefully from group to group, his practiced ease in conversation immediately putting nervous guests at their ease. Boris Johnson arrived fashionably on time, his distinctive figure easily recognizable as he made his way through the security checkpoint. Several guests turned to watch as the Prime Minister strode across the lawn, his confident gait carrying him toward the main reception area where Prince Charles was already engaged in animated discussion with a group of environmental scientists. The two men had worked together on numerous occasions, their professional relationship marked by mutual respect despite their different roles in British society. Charles appreciated Boris's intelligence and wit, while the Prime Minister admired the prince's dedication to causes that extended far beyond ceremonial duties. Their initial greeting was warm but brief, as protocol demanded that both men circulate among the diverse gathering of guests. Charles continued his conversations with charity workers who had been recognized for their outstanding contributions to their communities. Their stories of dedication and service clearly moved him, and he listened intently to their accounts of the challenges they faced in their important work. Boris found himself drawn into discussions with military veterans who had been invited to honor their service to the country. Their experiences spanning decades of conflict provided sobering reminders of the sacrifices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The Prime Minister's genuine interest in their stories was evident as he asked thoughtful questions about their post-service lives. Meanwhile, the weather began showing the first signs of the change that weather forecasters had failed to predict. The gentle breeze that had been pleasantly cooling the afternoon air gradually strengthened, causing the elegant table linens to flutter more noticeably. Ladies instinctively reached up to secure their carefully chosen hats, while gentlemen felt the first tugs at their ties. The palace staff, ever vigilant and experienced in outdoor events, began making subtle adjustments to the arrangements. Flower displays were moved to more sheltered positions, and serving tables were repositioned to protect the delicate pastries from any sudden gusts. Their movements were so professional and unobtrusive that most guests remained unaware of these precautionary measures. Prince Charles was deep in conversation with a remarkable woman who had established a network of food banks across northern England when the first drops of rain began to fall. They were barely noticeable at first, just occasional spots that might have been dismissed as imagination. However, the prince's long experience with British weather made him glance upward with a knowing expression. Boris had just finished hearing an inspiring account from a teacher who worked in one of London's most challenging schools when he too felt the unmistakable sensation of raindrops. Unlike many of the guests who seemed determined to ignore this development, the Prime Minister immediately began looking around for potential shelter. The palace gardens, beautiful as they were, offered limited protection from the elements. The white marquees could accommodate only a fraction of the hundreds of guests currently spread across the expansive lawns. Most attendees would need to make their own arrangements if the weather deteriorated significantly. As if responding to some invisible signal, the scattered drops quickly intensified into a steady drizzle. This was no brief summer shower that might pass in moments, but rather the beginning of what appeared to be a more substantial downpour. The carefully styled hair of many guests began showing the effects, and elegant outfits started acquiring unwelcome moisture. Prince Charles, ever the gracious host, seemed completely unbothered by this meteorological development. He continued his conversations with undiminished enthusiasm, occasionally wiping raindrops from his face with a casual gesture that suggested long familiarity with such interruptions to outdoor events. The guests themselves displayed the characteristic British response to unexpected rain, initially pretending not to notice while gradually acknowledging the reality of their situation. Conversations continued with determined cheerfulness, though the topics increasingly included rueful comments about the unreliability of weather forecasts. Palace staff appeared as if by magic, carrying umbrellas that they discreetly offered to guests who seemed most in need of protection. Their efficiency was remarkable, suggesting that contingency plans for exactly this situation had been thoroughly prepared and regularly rehearsed. Boris Johnson found himself in a slightly predicament. His usual confidence seemed momentarily shaken as he realized that his position as Prime Minister offered no special protection against the British climate. Unlike many of the guests who had arrived prepared with umbrellas, he had trusted entirely in the favorable forecast. The rain continued to intensify, transforming the elegant garden party into something resembling a good-natured endurance test. Yet rather than dampening spirits, the shared experience of dealing with unexpected weather seemed to bring the diverse group of guests closer together. Strangers offered to share umbrellas, and conversations took on a more intimate quality as people huddled together for protection. Prince Charles adapted to the changing conditions with the aplomb of someone who had attended countless outdoor events in every conceivable type of weather. His genuine interest in his guests remained unaffected by the moisture accumulating on his carefully pressed suit. If anything, the informal circumstances seemed to make his interactions more relaxed and natural. The afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn that would transform a routine royal gathering into a moment of pure human comedy that would be remembered and retold for years to come. As the rain transformed from a gentle drizzle into a more determined downpour, the palace staff sprang into action with military precision. Among them was James, a senior footman who had served the royal household for over 15 years. He had witnessed countless garden parties disrupted by Britain's unpredictable weather, and he knew exactly what needed to be done. James spotted Boris Johnson standing somewhat awkwardly near a group of guests, clearly in need of protection from the increasingly heavy rain. The Prime Minister's blonde hair was beginning to darken with moisture, and his usually immaculate appearance was showing signs of the weather's assault. Without hesitation, James approached with a large black umbrella, the kind specifically designed for such emergencies. Boris accepted the umbrella with genuine gratitude, flashing the footman his characteristic grin. However, what should have been a simple solution to a common problem was about to become considerably more complicated. The umbrella itself was substantial, with a wide canopy designed to protect multiple people if necessary. Its sturdy construction was intended to withstand exactly the kind of wind that was now beginning to accompany the rain. The Prime Minister had barely opened the umbrella when the first strong gust of wind caught it. The elegant garden party was rapidly developing into something more akin to a weather event, with sustained breezes giving way to intermittent, but powerful gusts that seemed to come from constantly changing directions. Boris gripped the umbrella handle firmly, determined to maintain his dignity despite the challenging circumstances. However, the wind had different plans entirely. What followed was a perfect demonstration of the age-old struggle between human determination and the forces of nature, played out before hundreds of amused onlookers. The first gust nearly yanked the umbrella from his hands entirely. Boris tightened his grip and adjusted his stance, drawing upon reserves of stubbornness that had served him well throughout his political career. The umbrella, however, seemed to have developed a will of its own, tugging and pulling against his efforts to control it. Prince Charles, who had been observing this developing situation from a short distance away, began to show the first signs of the amusement that would soon overcome his usual royal composure. The sight of the British Prime Minister engaged in mortal combat with a simple umbrella struck him as profoundly absurd. The wind gusted again, this time from a completely different angle. The umbrella's canopy inverted itself with a sound like a gunshot, turning the protective device into something resembling a giant flower blooming in reverse. Boris struggled to right it, his face displaying a mixture of concentration and growing frustration. Nearby guests had begun to take notice of the Prime Minister's predicament. What started as discreet glances evolved into more open observation as the battle intensified. The umbrella seemed determined to escape, twisting and turning with each fresh assault from the increasingly boisterous wind. Boris attempted to adopt a more scientific approach to the problem, analyzing the wind patterns and trying to position the umbrella to work with rather than against the natural forces. This strategy showed initial promise until a particularly violent gust arrived from an unexpected quarter, catching him completely off guard. The umbrella performed what could only be described as a complete somersault, its spokes bending in directions they were never intended to go. For a moment, Boris found himself holding what appeared to be a large, black, inside-out flower on a stick, while the rain continued to fall steadily upon his increasingly bedraggled appearance. Prince Charles could no longer contain his reaction to this escalating comedy. A small smile appeared at the corners of his mouth, growing more pronounced as Boris wrestled with his rebellious protective device. The prince's training in maintaining royal dignity was being severely tested by the sheer absurdity of the situation unfolding before him. The Prime Minister, perhaps sensing that he was providing entertainment for his royal host, redoubled his efforts to bring the umbrella under control. He planted his feet more firmly and attacked the problem with the kind of determination usually reserved for complex political negotiations. The umbrella, however, seemed unimpressed by his credentials and continued its campaign of resistance. Another powerful gust struck, and this time the umbrella's response was so dramatic that several nearby guests actually gasped. The entire structure turned completely inside out, while simultaneously attempting to drag Boris across the lawn. His grip on the handle remained firm, but his dignity was rapidly becoming a casualty of the meteorological conflict. The sight of the British Prime Minister being dragged sideways by an umbrella while rain poured down upon the assembled guests was beginning to strike many observers as hilariously surreal. The formal atmosphere of the royal garden party was giving way to something much more human and entertaining. Prince Charles found himself fighting an increasingly difficult battle against his own amusement. The combination of Boris's determined expression and the umbrella's seemingly malicious behavior was testing the limits of his ability to maintain appropriate royal composure. Small chuckles began to escape, despite his best efforts to remain properly dignified. The wind showed no signs of mercy, and neither did the umbrella. What had begun as a simple attempt to stay dry was evolving into a full-scale war between man and weather accessory, with an audience of hundreds watching every twist and turn of the increasingly ridiculous battle. The battle between Boris Johnson and his umbrella had reached epic proportions. What started as a simple weather-related inconvenience had transformed into the kind of slapstick comedy that would have been perfectly at home in a British farce. The Prime Minister's usually commanding presence was being systematically demolished by a piece of fabric stretched over metal spokes. Prince Charles stood approximately 20 feet away, ostensibly engaged in conversation with the Lord Lieutenant of Surrey about local heritage projects. However, his attention was increasingly drawn to the spectacular struggle taking place nearby. Each fresh assault by the wind produced a new chapter in what was becoming an unforgettable performance. The umbrella had somehow managed to achieve a state of constant motion, never settling into any recognizable configuration for more than a few seconds. Boris's attempts to control it were beginning to resemble an elaborate dance, complete with dramatic lunges, unexpected pivots, and moments of apparent triumph followed immediately by crushing defeat. A particularly aggressive gust caught the umbrella from below, transforming it into something resembling a large black parachute. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that the Prime Minister might actually become airborne. Boris's feet left the ground briefly as he struggled to maintain his connection to Earth, while the umbrella tried desperately to achieve flight. This moment proved to be Prince Charles's undoing. The sight of the British Prime Minister, one of the most powerful people in the country, being nearly lifted off his feet by a rebellious umbrella was simply too much for even royal composure to withstand. A small snort of laughter escaped before he could stop it. The prince immediately attempted to regain his dignified bearing, pressing his lips together firmly and trying to refocus on his conversation. However, the damage was done. The absurdity of the situation had breached his defenses, and he found himself in the precarious position of trying to suppress mounting amusement while maintaining the appearance of royal gravity. Boris, meanwhile, had adopted a new strategy that involved attempting to close the umbrella entirely rather than continuing to fight for control of its open form. This seemed logical in theory, but the umbrella's mechanism appeared to have jammed in the extended position, possibly damaged by the extreme stress of its recent adventures. The Prime Minister's efforts to collapse the umbrella resulted in a series of increasingly frantic gestures that looked like an interpretive dance about frustration. He pushed, pulled, twisted, and cajoled, but the umbrella remained stubbornly expanded and continued its chaotic movement in response to every fresh gust of wind. Prince Charles found himself caught between his duty to appear appropriately serious and the undeniable humor of watching one of Britain's senior politicians engaged in what appeared to be a wrestling match with an inanimate object. His shoulders began to shake slightly as suppressed laughter built up pressure behind his carefully maintained facade. The guests who had noticed the Prime Minister's predicament were displaying varying degrees of amusement and sympathy. Some looked genuinely concerned about his welfare, while others seemed to be enjoying the unexpected entertainment. A few had begun quietly pointing out the spectacle to their companions, creating small clusters of interested observers. Boris's hair, already disheveled by the rain, had achieved new levels of disorder thanks to his energetic battle with the umbrella. His usually neat appearance now suggested someone who had been wrestling with much larger and more aggressive opponents than weather accessories. Yet his expression remained determined, as if conquering this particular umbrella had become a matter of national importance. The umbrella executed another dramatic inversion, this time accompanied by a sound that suggested some of its internal structure might have sustained permanent damage. Boris steadied himself and prepared for another assault on the problem, his jaw set with the kind of determination usually reserved for international negotiations. Prince Charles attempted to take a sip of tea from the cup he had been holding, but found that his hand was trembling slightly with suppressed mirth. The contrast between the formal setting of the garden party and the absurd drama unfolding nearby had created a perfect storm of comedy that was proving irresistible. The wind chose that moment to launch its most ambitious attack yet. The umbrella spun completely around twice, dragged Boris 3 steps to his left, then attempted to wrap itself around his head like some kind of bizarre hat. The Prime Minister's muffled protests could be heard from within the fabric as he struggled to extract himself from this unexpected predicament. This final indignity proved to be the moment that broke Prince Charles's last reserves of self-control. The sight of the British Prime Minister apparently being consumed by his own umbrella while continuing to emit sounds of determined resistance was simply too absurd for anyone to witness with complete dignity intact. A small giggle escaped the prince's lips. Then another. Despite his 73 years of training in royal deportment, despite decades of maintaining perfect composure in the most challenging circumstances, Prince Charles found himself beginning to laugh at the spectacular absurdity of the scene before him. The giggle grew into a chuckle, then blossomed into the kind of genuine, delighted laughter that comes from witnessing something so perfectly ridiculous that it bypasses all intellectual filters and strikes directly at the funny bone. The Prince of Wales was giggling like a schoolboy at the sight of his Prime Minister losing a fight to an umbrella. Prince Charles's laughter was infectious in the way that genuine amusement always is. The sound of royal giggling carried across the rain-soaked garden, causing heads to turn and smiles to appear on faces throughout the gathering. His obvious delight in Boris's predicament gave everyone else permission to acknowledge what they had all been thinking. The Prime Minister, having finally extracted himself from his umbrella's attempt at capturing his head, looked up to see the Prince of Wales doubled over with laughter. Far from being embarrassed by this royal reaction to his struggle, Boris found himself grinning broadly. If he was going to be defeated by weather equipment, at least he was providing quality entertainment for distinguished company. The umbrella, as if sensing that its moment of glory was at hand, chose that instant to perform its most spectacular maneuver yet. A massive gust of wind caught it perfectly, spinning it like a pinwheel while Boris clung desperately to the handle. For several seconds, the Prime Minister appeared to be operating some kind of bizarre weather-powered carnival ride. Prince Charles's laughter intensified as he watched this latest development. Tears of mirth began forming in his eyes as the sheer persistence of both the umbrella's rebellion and Boris's determination to master it struck him as increasingly hilarious. His usual composed demeanor had completely dissolved into pure human amusement. Other guests, witnessing their prince's uninhibited reaction, began allowing their own carefully suppressed laughter to emerge. The formal atmosphere of the garden party transformed rapidly into something much warmer and more genuine. Strangers found themselves sharing amused glances and commenting freely on the ongoing comedy. Boris, realizing that resistance was futile, decided to embrace the absurdity of his situation. He began exaggerating his movements deliberately, turning his battle with the umbrella into a kind of impromptu performance. When the wind caught the umbrella and spun it dramatically, he spun along with it, arms outstretched like a dancer. This theatrical response to his predicament delighted Prince Charles even more. The sight of the British Prime Minister deliberately turning his weather-related struggles into entertainment demonstrated exactly the kind of good-natured resilience that he most admired in people. Boris's willingness to laugh at himself made the entire situation even more endearing. The umbrella, perhaps confused by this change in tactics, seemed to moderate its behavior slightly. Or possibly the wind was beginning to calm. Either way, Boris finally managed to achieve some degree of control over his rebellious protective device, though it continued to tug and pull like an eager dog on a leash. The rain had lightened considerably during the height of the umbrella battle, as if nature itself had been distracted by the comedy it had inadvertently created. Guests began emerging from their various shelters, drawn by the sounds of laughter and the obvious entertainment value of the ongoing spectacle. Prince Charles wiped tears of laughter from his eyes as he approached Boris, still chuckling at irregular intervals. The formality that usually characterized their public interactions had been completely washed away by rain and dissolved by shared humor. For this moment, they were simply two men who had found genuine amusement in life's unexpected absurdities. Boris offered the prince a sheepish grin as he finally achieved something approaching mastery over his umbrella. His hair remained magnificently disheveled, his suit bore the evidence of his struggles, and his dignity had taken a considerable battering. Yet his expression was one of pure good humor as he acknowledged the entertainment he had provided. The gathered guests spontaneously burst into applause, recognizing both the Prime Minister's good-natured handling of his predicament and the prince's delightfully human response to it. The sound of clapping mixed with continuing laughter created an atmosphere of warmth and genuine enjoyment that no amount of careful planning could have achieved. Even the palace staff, usually models of professional discretion, were struggling to maintain their composure. The sight of their normally dignified prince giggling helplessly at the Prime Minister's weather-related misfortunes was something they would undoubtedly share with their colleagues for years to come. As the immediate crisis passed, and both men attempted to restore some semblance of their usual appearances, the garden party resumed with a completely different energy. The shared laughter had broken down barriers and created connections between people who might otherwise have maintained polite but distant interactions throughout the afternoon. Prince Charles, still occasionally chuckling as he recalled particularly amusing moments from Boris's umbrella battle, found that conversations flowed more easily and naturally than they had before the weather intervention. The ice had been thoroughly broken, not by careful protocol, but by genuine human comedy. Boris, his umbrella finally, behaving somewhat reasonably, though still occasionally tugging rebelliously, discovered that his struggles had made him more approachable to the other guests. People felt comfortable sharing their own weather-related mishaps and laughing about the unpredictability of British climate. The afternoon continued with intermittent showers and occasional gusts of wind, but the mood remained buoyant and cheerful. The unexpected comedy had transformed what might have been a dampened formal gathering into a memorable celebration of human resilience, good humor, and the ability to find joy in life's most ridiculous moments. As the garden party drew to its close and guests began making their farewells, many commented that they would remember this particular royal gathering not for its formal aspects, but for the moment when their future king giggled with pure delight at watching their prime minister lose an epic battle against an umbrella in the rain. It was a reminder that beneath all the ceremony and protocol, the most memorable moments often come from the simplest human experiences shared with genuine warmth and laughter.